And joining us now is Tom Threlkeld, our friend, editor-in-chief of the DC Pro Sports Report. Great to have you here.
Great to be here, Bruce.
Good of you to stop by. We have a lot to get to. We're going to dive right in. We're in September. Yes. The Nats are playing better, but they've dug themselves a hole. Can they sustain quality play, breakout offense, quality pitching, get the relief, get the bullpen situation ironed out? Issues there, I think, at least from a fan perspective. 6.5. Give or take, depending on when you're watching the show.
Yeah, 6.5.
Can they close the gap and win the NL East?
Probably not. I mean, look, you know, they still have a chance. I really don't give them more than, say, a 10% chance to win the NL East, and that's the only shot they have at making the playoffs. They will not be a wild card team. You know, we've seen some improved offense from them in recent games. Part of it is Bryce Harper literally being a player that pitchers won't throw to. I mean, about 38% of the pitches thrown to Bryce Harper this year have been strikes. To put it into perspective, if you remember around the turn of the century when Barry Bonds was getting walked all that time, he got about 44% of the pitches thrown to him as strikes. So pitchers are even more wary of Harper than they were of Bonds. That's remarkable. And he's scoring runs because the guy right behind him, Ryan Zimmerman, has been on an absolute tear since he came off the disabled list on July 28th. He leads Major League Baseball in extra base hits and in runs batted in since that time. So Harper's patience at the plate, you know, he's really passed up, you know, opportunities to take crazy swings, has paid off because there is hitting behind him. But that has to continue, and they have to get much more consistent pitching. Not just the starting pitching, but the bullpen, which has been a gigantic dumpster fire and has been really handled very poorly by their manager, Matt Williams, the so-called reigning manager of the year.
Now, are fans and some within baseball coming down on Williams for the way he's handled the bullpen? Because this season, for a variety of reasons, probably injuries chief among them, just hasn't worked out, or because there's a real something you can point to in terms of how he's deployed the people he's had available.
Right. Well, let me say, first off, with injuries, the Nationals have had problems with injuries, but a team that they just struggled against, St. Louis, which is the best team in baseball, has had even more problems with injuries. And the Mets have had just as many problems with the Nationals, so I don't think that's an excuse. Look, Matt Williams' refusal to break out of his mold of how he thinks these relievers have to be used has really been a problem. I mean, it leads him, for instance, in the second game of that Cardinals series, he puts in Drew Storen in the eighth because that's what he does. He puts in Drew Storen in the eighth, and Storen doesn't have it. They come back in the ninth of the tie game. The night before, Casey Janssen had been demolished by the Cardinals. Nevertheless, he puts him in because it's a tie game in the ninth. He doesn't have a lead. He puts in Jansen, and it's like throwing an arsonist into a fireworks factory. I mean, the whole thing blows up. They lose the game. Papelbon doesn't see the field. And here's the problem with that. He's their best reliever, and he's not getting into games. And Williams is absolutely wedded to this notion of Papelbon, the team's best reliever, doesn't come in unless they have a lead. And Storen has to be in the eighth. It's really a problem. He's showing an incredible lack of imagination, a lack of creativity, and his rigid adherence to these rules has hurt the Nationals bullpen and has cost them games when they knew they had to win games, when they've seen where the Mets had lost a game and here's a real chance to pick it up. He sticks with these stupid rules, and the result is a catastrophe.
Someone way smarter than me said that this rigid, robotic, some call it paint-by-numbers approach to who pitches when, the seventh guy, eighth guy, ninth guy, they described it as the continual search for the guy who doesn't have it on a given night. You put a guy in, he's mowing people down, pull him. Why? Why do that? If the guy's in, he's got his, he's in command, he's making it happen.
Right.
For heaven's sake.
Yeah, I don't understand why Papelbon can't come in the middle of an inning, for example. Is Papelbon, who really hasn't pitched very much, is he really incapable of pitching, of getting 4 outs? Is 4 just too much instead of 3? And Jansen, who'd thrown a lot of pitches a night before because he'd been knocked around, comes back in, has to throw a bunch more, far more pitches, 45, 50 pitches in back-to-back nights. he's not accustomed to that. He's getting crushed, and Williams just sits there in the dugout staring at this fiasco, and it's like he knows nothing about handling pitchers, and so therefore he just goes by the rule book regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how the pitchers look. It's mind-boggling.
My pen got so upset the cap just flew off. But that's where we're at. Let's shift gears, talk about the NFL preseason now wrapped up. As Jay Gruden sits back, as he's got some very important roster decisions to make, where are we heading into Week 1, Miami?
Well, I think we have a team that is ready to play real games and focus on what's going on in the field. I'm sure we'll get to that later. But, yeah, look, I mean, we have a team where I think that there is a little more confidence in the offense this time because I think everyone understands, particularly the players, that head coach Jay Gruden made a decision at quarterback that was based on production. It wasn't just we have to give this guy the job because the owner insists on it or because we gave up so much to get him. So everyone else has to put their career on hold while we figure out if this guy can play. Gruden looked at it. He said, I've seen enough. We went through this last year. I've seen enough. We're going with Kirk Cousins, which I think is the correct choice. I don't think there's any doubt that he outplayed RG3, Robert Griffin III. And so I think there's more confidence there. However, there are some major issues on the offensive line. We saw some of those in the final preseason game. There were some people questioning whether or not Brandon Scherff, the team's first overall pick, who was drafted to play right tackle and then moved to right guard, think, hey, maybe he's just not very good. Well, when they played the Jacksonville Jaguars in the fourth preseason game, we saw why Scherff was moved to guard. Is because the guy they played in place of because all the starters didn't play, a guy named Spencer Long, who was a third-round draft pick the year before. He committed 2 holding penalties, gave up a sack, and then missed a block, which allowed a screen pass to a running back to lose 4 yards. He was a catastrophe, and he played only against backups for a bad Jaguars team. That is the reason Scherff moved to guard, because they couldn't imagine Spencer Long facing Ndamukong Suh, which is what you're going to have to do in just a few days when they line up for the season opener against Miami. So that's going to be a real issue. You can move quarterbacks in and out, but if this team doesn't block for the quarterback, it doesn't matter. They won't need 3 quarterbacks on the roster. They'll need 6.
There's an interesting, and you've sort of alluded to it, you've touched on it, and it's not unique to this team or even football. There's an interesting issue when you pay a lot, or when you, in the case of Griffin, when you mortgage your future to get a certain guy. But the same holds true if someone gets a 10-year, $1 billion contract, so you're paying out the nose, and the feeling is you got. So what happens when that person is not a performer? Right. What happens when that person is not productive? What happens when they're not the best you have available to help the team right now? Right. You know, if you think about it in investment terms, if you had $100,000 and that's real money for you, that's important dough, and you invest it, and you're down to 70 because your investments don't pan out. Well, do you stick with the investments that got you to 70, or do you make new decisions independent of where you were, back at 100? Right. Because it's like, okay, now I have 70, and I've got to grow that 70.
Yeah, you've got to look at a situation like that based on the evidence. And if you look at the evidence, say, in that investment situation and say, this has been a tough couple of weeks, but the evidence that I read leads me to think it'll turn around, then maybe you put more money into it. But that's what Gruden did here. He looked at the evidence before him. He's been watching RG3 and Kirk Cousins and Colt McCoy through the summer, all through training camp and preseason. And what he saw is what everyone saw, which is RG3 is the 3rd best quarterback on this team.
But what happened from February when he was anointed the starter, and now we find out after the fact that there really was a competition and that Kirk Cousins won it when the evidence was staring us in the face then as it is now.
The Skins had a very weaselly little arrangement where they didn't want to answer questions. They didn't want to have an open competition. They didn't want to constantly be bombarded with questions about the media. So they just decided to name RG3 the starter, even though both the head coach and the general manager were not convinced that RG3 could be the starter or should be. And when it came time down to it, Gruden just threw all that out and said, we're done with it. RG3 is not the starter anymore.
Even though everyone knows that at every position there is always a competition, and the starters get determined based on performance Or so we believe.
That's right.
Why shouldn't it be at all positions if it's...
I absolutely agree. I think a lot of it had to do with the sensitivity about what was given up for him and with, let's face it, the owner's incredible... The owner he doesn't have Thanksgiving dinner with every Redskins player. It was just with RG3.
Talking with Tom Threlkeld of the DC Pro Sports Report. Back with more after this.